Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar looking at grant writing and fundraising and identifying and getting the resources needed for your projects within your We Thrive team as well as within your community. My name is Mary Ellen Kramer and I'm a senior health educator here at Hamilton County Public Health and work with We Thrive teams and communities across the county. So an overview of our presentation today. First, we're going to talk about kind of requests for resources and looking at resource development. We'll talk about using data to write goals and objectives and why that's important when trying to get funding or other resources for your projects. Talk through some key steps in writing any grant application, as well as talk through different types of fundraisers that your communities you may be able to implement within your community. So first we're going to talk about resource development. And what is resource development? So resource development is the process of gathering information to be able to show the need and the impact of the resources within your community. And we say resources broadly because resources could be donations, it could be volunteers, it could be grant opportunities, it could be a fundraising event, it could be donations of time, donations of money, actual items. So there's a whole lot of different possibilities and opportunities when you think of resources and kind of creating a request for those resources. So as you're talking to think through some of the resource requests, and this is going to be true for fundraising and grant writing as well. So you want your request to be informative, kind of contain the who, what, where, when, and how components of the project. It's an opportunity to gather support for your project. It's a way to demonstrate the need within your community for this specific project or just the need in general within your community. And lastly, it's a way to show how what you're doing will make an impact in the community. So items to include when you're creating a resource development request or kind of a request for resources. So you're going to want to look at assessment data, and so this could be demographic data for your community. It could be a policy review information, so kind of reviewing the policies that are in the book within your child care center or school or space-based organization. And really with the data, you wanted to highlight the need within the community. Typically in a request, there's going to be some form of an action plan. Some requests are going to have a more formal action plan than others, but you want it to include kind of goals and objectives, and we'll get into an action plan and kind of those components in a little bit. You'll want to kind of talk about how you will use the funds or resources that you're asking for. So some requests will ask you for a budget, which we'll talk through in a little bit. And then this is an opportunity to show how you're going to implement that action plan and how the funds and the resources, the items that you're requesting will be put to use. You might have to identify partners, so who's helping, is anyone else contributing to this project? Do you have in-kind support from your school district or from your village, township, or city? Sometimes you're going to want to look at evaluation, and then the last piece is going to be sustainability. So how are you going to sustain this initiative beyond the initial request and kind of the initial funding or resources that comes into your community? So we're going to go ahead and take a little bit deeper dive into some of these items within the request. So the assessment data. So to paint a picture of your community and kind of the project that you're working on, the data should help to provide a direction for your team or coalition. So if we're looking at results from an assessment that you did and you saw that safe sidewalks was a huge concern within your community, then that data could help provide that direction of maybe we need to look at sidewalks, or maybe we need to look at crossings within the community if you're seeing a high rate of pedestrian injuries. The assessment data will highlight areas of need, and as well, it will provide a strong ground for goal creation when you're trying to figure out where you want to go. Potential data sources are the community health assessments that we provide for We Thrive communities, the behavioral risk factor surveillance system, or the youth risk behavior system, which are national surveys conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Health foundations may have some. The change tool assessment if you're working on the chronic disease pathway, or any of the other pathway assessments that you work through. Tobacco store alert data, which is looking at point of sales and marketing within a convenience store. So lots of different opportunities for data. If you have questions about data or aren't sure where to find data, you can always reach out to your health educator, and then they'll be happy to provide support. So goals and objectives. So goals provide the framework. They are the long-term plan, vision for your team or community. So an example of a goal would be, by 2020, there will be a 10% decrease in the adult obesity rate within Hamilton County. So there's a time on it, by 2020. It's specific. We'll have a 10% decrease, which is measurable because we have a data source for adult obesity. We feel like that would be attainable and a realistic goal. An objective kind of provides the blueprint, so they're shorter time frames that will help you achieve things to help it kind of achieve that overall goal. So your objectives and achieving objectives puts you closer to achieving that overall goal that you created. So a potential objective could be by December 31st of 2018, 5 strategies will be implemented to increase access to healthy foods within the village of Lockland. So it's time-bound. We have an end date. It's specific. We're looking at 5 strategies. It's measurable. We'll be able to measure the 5 strategies that are implemented. And again, it's attainable and realistic. So those items that I just went through, are kind of making your goals and objectives SMART, as you can see on the screen, on the last bullet point. So SMART goals and objectives specific. You can measure them. They're measurable. They're attainable. They're realistic, and there's some sort of time bound to them. So you have set an end date by which you hope to achieve that goal or objective. So how might you create and or prioritize goals and objectives? So based on your assessment data, you really want to start with that assessment data and that finding, which will highlight the need. You could be able to write down all possible goals and objectives that your team would like to work on. From there, you can kind of develop some criteria, and we'll go through some questions on the next slide to kind of see which ones may be low-hanging fruit or more easy projects that won't take quite as long. You have all the support, you have the resources that you need. You might, want to look at, okay, do we have the support for this objective? Do we have staff and supporters within the school that support 100% tobacco-free policy, or do we need to spend some time building that support? And then the last kind of thing you might want to think about is, do we have the funds and resources available to achieve this objective, or do we need to figure out funding first and make that a key part before we're actually able to achieve? So some other items or questions to consider, and if you wanted to, you list your We Thrive team listed out 8 different objectives, and you're trying to narrow it down to 3. These could be some questions that could help. So when we look at importance, here are some questions. Will this lead to behavior or an environmental change? What is the goal of this objective, and will it help the overall health of our community? Could this result in a policy change? You hear us talk, and we've done webinars on policy systems and environmental changes, but you want the work that you're doing to be sustainable and to build on each other. Would this be considered a best practice? A lot of grants will want you to do activities that are considered best practice or gold standard. If the grant doesn't outline what is best practice, you can reach out to your health educator for support in kind of determining, is this a best practice activity? Is this something that will be beneficial within our community? And then the last one, will this be a sustainable effort? How are we going to sustain the project? There are some fabulous objectives that teams have created, but once the resources go away, the objective and that activity goes away. So really trying to build in sustainability as well. And then the other kind of side to look at is feasibility. Can we really do this? Do we have all the support that we need to achieve this objective? And do we have or can we get the resources that are needed? Just because you don't have the resources right now to achieve an objective doesn't mean that you should not consider that objective. If you think you can get the resources, then it's absolutely, we would encourage you to kind of write that objective and include it within your action plan. So we're going to kind of switch and go into grant writing. So we kind of set the stage by talking about resource development and what that is, and when we look at creating requests for different resources, some of those key components. So the first thing is kind of creating your action plan. So you've talked through your objectives and your goals, and you're going to build out an action plan that's going to outline the work that you're going to do. And I know there have been more other webinars that go way more in depth than I'm going right now around goals and objectives and creating action plans. So if you have any questions about that, I encourage you to go back and take a look. So the other thing you see on your screen are common components of action plans. So action steps, what are those steps that are going to get you from point A to point B? What is the timeline? Who's responsible? What are the resources that are needed, and how are we going to know if we are successful? So why are we talking about goals and objectives as we're talking about grant writing? So there's a couple reasons. Having kind of a developed action plan that includes goals and objectives can help you to identify what resource needs you have within your community to achieve the goals and objectives you've set out for your team. And again, those resources could be funding, could be supplies, could be people. An action plan helps to provide a roadmap for how needs within the community are being addressed. And funders like to see that there's a plan in place and that you've been doing work to try to achieve this goal on your own. Having the plan also shows funders that thought has gone into the request that you're submitting, and this is something that you truly believe will best impact your community. And an action plan can also show support from others, be it partners, other We Thrive team members, as well as in-kind donations. So while, as you'll see as we go through kind of writing a grant application, you might have to develop a grant-specific action plan, having an idea of goals and objectives that your We Thrive team would like to work on will be beneficial as you're looking for funding and trying to identify opportunities to get those resources you need. So where can you find grant opportunities? Web searches are great places to start. Kind of think of some keywords that you're looking to work on within your objective. So if one of your objectives is increasing the recycling rate within your community, you could do some web searches looking at recycling grant opportunities, decreasing waste grant opportunities, and kind of see what pops up. If you are a We Thrive community, then at least one individual is in your community are receiving our We Thrive Learning Collaborative emails. So these emails contain a lot of information related to grants and grant opportunities that you can apply for. Utilize your networks and partners. If you know someone within a foundation, or if you have a connection to a local business, ask them what the process is to request funding or request resources from that organization. Not all these requests are going to be big, large grant applications. I think requests for Walmart or Home Depot are a few questions. They ask you to put a proposal together. That's maybe a page and a half that you then submit. And then you can always utilize your connection with us here at the health department, so kind of reaching out to your health educator and seeing what grant opportunities we're aware of that could help benefit your community. So some potential places to start, government grants, you could search that, the Foundation Center, the Grantsmanship Center, Nonprofit Resource Center, Kids Gardening, Kaboom, Department of Natural Resources, Safe Routes to Schools, are all organizations that we know have grants out at certain times throughout the year. So again, having an idea of what funding your needs are and what the project is allows you to have a more specific search as you're out there looking for potential grant opportunities. So over the next two slides, we're going to talk about different types of funding sources just for you guys to kind of see and have an understanding of the differences. So the first two we're going to talk about are federal and state funds. So if you were to apply for a federal grant or looking for federal funds, some key points to think about are the amount of funds available change with political climate and with political will. Often within a federal grant, they are going to tell you what to do. They're going to be prescriptive and say, this is the goals that you're working on, and here's some objectives. You may have some room to figure out how exactly it's implemented in your community, but it can be pretty specific. There's often a slow review process, and it tends to be larger grants over an extended time frame. As we're looking at state funds, often when they have money, they won't tell you, so it's kind of going on the Department of Health, the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, the Department of Veterans Affairs, all the different websites, and kind of looking for grant opportunities. When budgets decrease, typically the work then gets outsourced, so there could be an increase in opportunities. Similar to federal funds, they can be very prescriptive when it comes to the activities that you are to implement, and they tend to be larger grants as well. So not saying that state and federal grants are not a good match for your community or for your school, but I think you might have better luck as we look at foundations, nonprofits, and or corporations. So as you look at foundations or nonprofits, they're cause-driven, so finding a nonprofit whose cause, whose mission aligns with the work that you're doing. Personal relationships matter, so sometimes it's you have to lay kind of that groundwork of building relationships within that foundation so that they get to know you and the work that you're doing within your community. Sometimes it can be tied to a specific community, and that term community could be broad. It could be tied to a specific zip code. It could be tied to the work must be completed in schools. It could be tied to the work must be in child care centers. So again, it's really trying to do that research and figure out the best fit. There's roughly $10 billion annually in foundation grant opportunities, and there tends to be a quicker review process than you'll see with state or federal grants. As we look at corporations, It supports a specific agenda or brand. So again, finding corporations whose mission, whose brand aligns with the work you're doing. Corporations have the opportunity to utilize their employees for volunteer hours or man hours. Corporations often want to give donations or mini grants or volunteer time because it helps to improve their image and it's an opportunity for them to be recognized. And it can be good for small or one-time requests as well. So those are kind of some big picture differences that we see among different funding sources. So as you find various grants, you'll want to review the grant application. Here are some guidelines in reviewing the grant application as you start to write them. So every grant application is going to have some sort of guidelines. You want to read the guidelines, reread them, and reread them. It's often helpful to print them out so that you can refer to them while writing the application. Within the guidelines, there will be information about font size, margin, number of pages, word limits, how the application must be submitted. Are there additional forms that need to be filled out? Pay attention to that information. That's really important. The guidelines will also break down what should be included in the proposal, what questions to answer. Follow the guidelines is key to making sure your application is read and not thrown out or disqualified. Before the application, review the funding requirements. Make sure the program aligns with the requirements of the grant. Do you meet the eligibility requirements? Is your proposed project within the scope of the funding agency? Or do you need to partner with an agency if your organization doesn't meet the applicant requirements from the funder? Review the expectations of the grant if awarded. Will you be able to meet all the requirements and expectations that are around budgets, reporting, follow-up? Is there a match or an in-kind aspect of the grant that you need to meet? If you cannot meet the expectations, then the grant is not a good fit for your project, for your team, for your community, and I would encourage you to move on and find the next opportunity. This document is often called an RFP or an RFS, which stands for a Request for a Proposal or Request for Solicitation. And then just, again, some final information. The request for proposal, request for solicitation, read, know that in and out. That is going to tell you everything that you need to know for grant application, such as how much funding is available. Is this a one-year grant or a multiple-year grant? Are there specific strategies that you need or activities that you need to implement within the grant? What are the grant reporting requirements? And then what documents or format of the grant need to be submitted? So there's kind of 5 overall elements of a grant proposal that are pretty standard across most proposals. So you have an executive or project summary, organizational information, project narrative, a budget, and potentially a budget narrative, and then support materials such as work plans or letters of support. Use the guidelines for the specific funding that you're applying to and when you're trying to create your proposal. Those guidelines supersede this presentation. So what is the executive or project summary? Typically, it's 2 or 3 pages. It summarizes the application and the proposed strategies and activities that you're planning to implement. It's informative to the reader as they're going through it, and that the information is written in a way that someone working in a different field or a lay reader would be able to understand. This is often the first element of the proposal within your completed proposal, but it's often the last section of the grant application to be written because it's a summary. So it's helpful to complete all of the other sections first so that you have an idea of what you're writing in the summary. So organizational information. This establishes the ability to implement a successful project. So you're going to talk about your organization's history, your community's history with grants within this specific realm, within the specific project. You'll kind of talk about the staffing needs of the project. Do you have someone that can do project management, that could take lead on finance? Are there support staff that are needed? And who are key partners? Not all staff on a grant proposal have to be paid. Some of them can be volunteers that are providing support. So the project narrative. This is the largest section within any grant application. So it's going to talk through background and need, goals and objectives, strategies, evaluation, and sustainability. And values matter within the project narrative and within the entire grant application because you want the values that you're proposing within your application to match the values of the agency that is offering the funding. So now we're going to look at each of these sections within the project narrative. So the background and need talks about the priority population to be served. It provides some community-specific characteristics about that priority population, such as demographics, health status, the need, the geographic area. It will talk through the capacity of the team to implement the grant proposal, and it will use assessment data that's been reviewed by the team to help build the case. Within the project description, you are proposing what you plan to do and how you intend to do it. So it's kind of an overview of how you plan to get from point A to point B, what are the key steps and activities that need to happen, and what is the timeline for implementation. You will talk through how the project differs from what is currently being done to address the problem, if there's anything currently being done within your community. So maybe you are expanding the reach of the program, you're reaching a different population than other activity or other programs or initiatives, or you're looking to expand the program or intervention that you're implementing within that priority population. It'll often kind of have goals and objectives, and that's kind of where the action plan can be helpful. Go back to the guidelines of the grant application and see what format for the action plan they want. So often they have very specific formats for the goals and objectives. This is probably the bulk of the project narrative section because this is really where you get to describe what you plan to do and how you're going to do it. Evaluation, it will identify measures of success that you've identified. You'll talk through how you plan to evaluate the effectiveness of the activities. As you think about evaluation, think of qualitative data versus quantitative data. So that qualitative data is subjective. It tells the story of your project or the story of the need and how these activities have made improvements. And then quantitative is objective, it's by the numbers. It will kind of talk about number of people reached, number of programs implemented, those sorts of things. And then, looking at sustainability. Funders like to know that you're committed to the project and that you're thinking about sustainability from the beginning. So when the project funding ends or the resources are dried up, you have a plan in place and additional resources or support to be able to help sustain the project. So within grant applications, there could be two different formats for your budget. There could be a line item budget in which you're listing out all of the cost and kind of associating it with a category or component. Or it could be a budget narrative, which is an opportunity to write out and kind of describe how you came up with those line item budget amounts and why this budget item is needed within the implementation of the grant proposal. Common budget components include personnel, supplies, contracts or consultants, travel or mileage, equipment needed if there's matching funds required, or other things that are specific to that grant proposal. And then that final section of the grant application is the supporting materials. So the appendix potentially could be program plans, which are, again, those grant-specific action plans that the guidelines tell you how to create and what to include. You might be required to include letters of support or success stories from past grants or projects that you've implemented, policies. If the grant requires that you have a policy around bike helmets already in place, then you might have to submit a copy of that policy to the funder. You know, for all of the Safe Routes to School funding through the Ohio Department of Transportation, councils have to adopt a resolution or a policy saying that they support the funding. So some funders are going to require that. It's important to keep in mind if that is required, and making sure that you build in enough time to be able to get that resolution from council so that it can be submitted with your grant application. Rosters, if having a consortium or a team like already established is a requirement, then you might need to prove or kind of send that list of here are current team members. And then every grant is different, so there could be additional clarifying and or support documents. You know, for the Safe Routes to School application, there are pictures that are required to be uploaded as supporting documents for the proposal. So go back to the guidelines, read the guidelines, highlight, write all over the guidelines, because they'll be able to tell you what's required and kind of what are those supporting materials. So you've gotten everything together, you're getting ready to submit. What is that final check? So make sure that you followed all of the application guidelines and formats. You responded to each question within the guidelines. Spell check, grammar check, important. It's always helpful to have someone else read the proposal for clarity, because it makes sense to you and in your mind because you're the one who wrote it, but could another person read it and have a clear understanding of what you're doing? Submitting on time is a must. If your application is not submitted on time, the majority of the time for grants is automatically disqualified. So you potentially just put a lot of time and a lot of energy into creating this grant application, but if it's not submitted on time or you don't follow the guidelines that are set out in the application, those can be automatic disqualifications, and then you don't even get a chance for your application to be reviewed. And then make sure that all of the required attachments are included. So next steps. You've submitted your grant and you've heard back from the funder. Congratulations, you got the grant. Now what do you do? Well, now the true work begins because you're working on implementing your projects. Announce your successes to your council members, to the local newspaper, to your We Thrive team, to your We Thrive health educator, and then review and follow the funder expectations in terms of budget, reporting, when you send in success stories. Because, if you have received a grant from a foundation or a corporation, you want to be a great grantee. You want to spend the money how you're supposed to. You want to meet all of the requirements and expectations. You want to submit all your reporting on time, because then you're your team, your community, your agency has a good reputation with a funder, and those personal relationships matter, like we talked about before. So it's always really important that once you receive grant funding, that you are the best steward of that grant funding that you can be, and that you really try to meet all of those expectations. And if you get feedback that you didn't get funded, it happens to all of us, but don't give up. You know, embrace rejection, learn why your application wasn't funded, learn from those lessons, find strategies to keep the momentum moving forward in your community, see if there's an opportunity for you to revise and resubmit your application, or if you revise and resubmit at the following, the next grant cycle. And, take the feedback from the funder to heart, and try to make those enhancements. So that is a very quick, high-level overview of the grant writing process. I have written multiple grants myself, and I would say the most important piece of information I can tell you is review the guidelines. Follow those guidelines. I typically always print out a copy of those guidelines, and by the end, I've highlighted it, I have notes in the columns, I have Post-it notes in it, all with kind of information to make sure that I stay on track and that I'm meeting all of the grant requirements. Because the last thing I want to do is to miss a question or miss a component and then have my application automatically be disqualified. I've been on grant reviewing side of it as well. And that spell check, grammar check, and following guidelines are some of, mistakes that we saw more often than I was expecting. If the grant guidelines say submit in 12-point Times New Roman font with 1-inch margins and be, double spaced, then when you submit your application, your narrative should be in 12-point Times New Roman font, 1-inch margins, and double spaced. That's what they're asking for, so you want to give them those format requirements. There's typically reasons behind it, and it may not always make sense to you, but it does allow them, to be consistent, and ultimately you want your grant to be reviewed and to be scored so that you have the possibility to receive funding. If your team or community is researching or starting the grant writing process, feel free to reach out to your health educator. We're happy to provide support. We won't write the grant application for you, but we can definitely provide some support for you and your team as you're going through that process. So, okay, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about fundraisers and different types or categories of fundraisers and different ideas. So fundraising is another opportunity for your team to gather the resources that you need to implement the project. So again, you could be fundraising for money, you could be fundraising for a specific item or product, or fundraising for a cause or to kind of get the word out there about your team. So in some of the research that I did around fundraising, I kind of came up with these categories as some of the big categories out there within the fundraising world. So we'll go in depth for each of these categories. I'll provide a definition and then some ideas. So the categories are provide a service, some sort of a thon, events, raffles, games or a contest, sales, or sponsorship and donation. So provide a service. So within this type of fundraiser, you're identifying a service that is needed within your community. You then offer that service to community members for a certain fee or ask for donations. So potential services or ideas that you could do, car washes, rent a youth for a day, in which a community member or an organization could rent a high school student for, a couple hours to help with yard work or to help with organization or raking leaves or certain activities that maybe not everyone in the community could do. Dress up your car, and so this was looking at paying or having students paint your car with car paint, either for school spirit or for community pride, for with the We Thrive themes. So just a different and fun way to show pride within the community. Offering yard cleanup services or snow removal services, and then movie in a park night, in which you're offering a movie to the community members, or movie at the pool, and maybe you're charging, you have some concessions that you're charging for, or at the end of the night you ask folks for a donation. So the next one is blank-a-thon. So within this type of fundraiser, you're getting donations or pledges from community members, and typically the individual asking for those donations, pledges, will then pledge themselves to do a certain number of the specific activity. For example, walk-a-thon. A community member will get donations and pledges from other community members, and they pledge, for every mile I walk, my neighbor across the street agreed to give me $1. So then, over the course of the day, however many miles that individual walked, the friend would give $1 times the number of miles. You could have a dance-a-thon, you could have a math-a-thon, you could have a trike-a-thon to involve the little kids as well. So lots of different opportunities there. The next type of core category is events. So these are one-time events where you can charge an entrance fee to those who participate to the event. Items could also be for sale within the event to increase the amount of money raised. So you could have a community day, a huge community festival, and maybe it's free to attend, but you have, a 50-50 raffle happening within the festival, or, you have to pay for drinks or food or whatever. You could have a chili cook-off event in which participants would pay to be able to test the different chilies that were there and then be able to vote for their favorite. If you're partnering with a school district, you could have an out-of-uniform day in which the students pay $1 or something to be out of uniform. You can have sport tournaments, pancake breakfast. So there's lots of different events. These events can, be on a smaller scale and don't necessarily take a lot of planning and prep to hold the event, an out-of-uniform day. To more complex events, potentially a sports tournament that's a multi-day event. So just kind of keep that in mind and figure out what your team or community has the capacity to do. Raffles, which are an opportunity for community members to earn prize or money. Potential ideas include a 50-50 raffle in terms like people buy tickets, and at the end you pull one ticket, your organization keeps half of it, and then the winning ticket keeps the other half. You could have a silent auction where folks are bidding on different items. You could raffle off money or prizes in which people are buying tickets. You can have a basket raffles in which you have different baskets that have items or themes. So one basket could be Reds baseball theme and have tickets and other Reds baseball items in there. It could be that it's a a healthy eating or physical activity themed basket. And a lot of times you can get donations for those baskets from the community members themselves, from organizations, and or from businesses. And then the last one is you could potentially do an art raffle and raffle off a piece of art. All right, so games or contest. Some community members enjoy being competitive, and so this is an opportunity for folks to be competitive while raising money for your cause. So potential ideas could be a penny wars within a school, or between sports teams, but really, whoever has the largest amount of money at the end wins, and there could be some small prize. You could have a dunking booth at a community festival or other event, and put, some key folks from the village that everyone knows or from the community in there, and then people have to pay to throw a ball to potentially dunk that person. Watermelon eating contest. You could have a guessing game jar where you put items in a jar and people pay to be able to guess the number of items in that. And then whoever has the most whoever guesses the correct number of items or is the closest to that items wins what's in the jar. I thought the last one was kind of fun. You could have a save it or shave it contest in which you identify an individual. So if a school district were to do this, maybe the principal or a teacher would agree to shave their head. And so they have kind of two jars similar to a penny war, and students are placing money in those jars. And, some students don't want them to have to shave their head, so they would put it in the save it jar, or if students want that individual to have to shave their head, they would put it in the shave it jar. So it's just another twist on the penny wars. And then the last idea are kind of sales. So community members would sell items. Could be craft or items made by the community, or food items or everyday items. For the biggest profit, teams are encouraged to get business sponsorships and or donations to help with the sales. Potential ideas could be event calendars, yard sales, craft aid, food items for sale. I know that there's like chocolate bar and pizza and cookies, and not that those are all the healthiest items, but flower tree sales or discount cards. And then the last one is kind of getting sponsorship or donations. So working with local businesses, organizations, or churches to support your cause. Some of the other fundraising ideas that we just talked about may need sponsorship or donations in order to maximize the profits, and no amount is too small. In the very beginning, we talked about that resource request development and kind of knowing what projects you want to work on and where the funding would go. That information is also going to be really helpful when you're fundraising. You have to be able to convey a story. You have to be able to share with the larger community why you're doing this fundraiser, why is it important, what is it, who's benefiting. And so the more that you can tell that story and highlight the need, I think the greater success that you will have. All right. So then in summary, identify fundraisers that will be supported and received well from community members and or your target audience. So not all these ideas are going to work in every community, and that's okay. Tailor what you think is going to work best in your community. You are the expert within that community. Be very clear in your ask and what the cause is. Make sure that, like I said, you're able to tell that story, and that helps your cause and the ask kind of stand apart from others who might be fundraising as well. Having an action plan can help identify what resources are needed to complete the action plan. The identified goals and objectives that you created within the action plan will be helpful when grant writing or for when asking for donations. So really everything of that ties in and kind of helps complete the cycle. So I know action planning is not always the most exciting project or activity, but it's really important that we complete action planning and develop comprehensions so that when we are asking for fundraising or donations or sponsorships or trying to write a grant application, we have the action plan to help provide support. So here's my contact information. I thank you for participating and listening to this webinar. If you have any follow-up questions, you can reach out to myself either through my phone number, 946-7926, or through my email address that you see on the screen. I thank you again for your participation, and I'm excited to hear about all of the great grant awards or fundraising events that you guys throw within your community. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.